Welcome back to World Roundup on France 24. Here's a reminder of our main news headlines. Doha confirms there were no casualties after Iran fired 19 missiles towards a US military base in Qatar in retaliation for the bombing of its nuclear sites. The attack is being dismissed as very weak by Donald Trump. Millions seek shelter across Israel as Iran conducted a ballistic missile attack with sirens sounding across the country and blasts heard over Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Israel is expanding its campaign targeting sites symbolic to the country's theocracy, saying it's carried out its most extensive wave of attacks ever against Iran. Well, Donald Trump is tonight dismissing Iran's retaliatory strikes that targeted a US base in Qatar as very weak and welcoming the early notice he said was given by Tehran after it fired 19 missiles towards the military facility. The rockets were successfully intercepted and no casualties have been reported by either the US or Qatar. The strike targeting the largest US military installation in the Middle East. Well, for more, let's bring in Dr Gavin Hall, a NATO expert and also a teaching fellow in political science and international security at the University of Strathclyde. Thanks so much for being with us this evening, Gavin. So in the last little while, we've heard from Donald Trump. He's given us some reaction to the developments today in Qatar, saying he hopes now that Iran and Israel will proceed to peace. Were you expecting this kind of response from Donald Trump, or something perhaps a little more bellicose? What do you think?
Well, good evening. First of all, I'd say I think Donald Trump's response, dismissing it as being weak, is a fairly predictable response and is probably what most commentators and the Iranian government themselves would have expected, because what they've effectively done in targeting this base in Qatar with the pre-warning and everything else is exactly the same as what they did in January 2020 after the United States had effectively assassinated General Suleiman, who was their sort of top military commander of their Revolutionary Guard. So at that point, then similar response, and then there was no further action from Donald Trump at that point. So the Iranian government's probably calculated that this could very well be a way to signal to their domestic audience that, hey, look, we've actually responded to the attacks here. We've demonstrated our capability. We now expect sort of no further action, and we can potentially help to bring this series of attacks between Israel and Iran to a close.
Has Donald Trump's gamble paid off then in terms of the decision to strike those Iranian nuclear facilities?
Possibly. Part of the key analysis will come in is what actual damage has been done, how much impact is the strike's going to have on the ability of the Fordo nuclear enrichment plant to be able to carry on operating. It'll be probably a good while until the level of damage, if there is any, is actually known, or whether indeed Iran had actually moved out some of the uranium from the site beforehand. Even if they had moved out some of the uranium beforehand, though, it still needs a facility to enrich it to be able to make it usable for a potential nuclear device. So it's almost certainly it's had an impact and will have delayed Iran's potential to acquire a nuclear weapon. So the United States will probably be able to claim this is a great success. And after all, it's demonstrated a high level of capability to carry out a precision attack. But what it actually means in the slightly longer term, say beyond 5 or 6 months, is probably a lot less clear.
And what kind of capabilities does Iran have at this point? What would you have expected to see it targeting the Strait of Hormuz? We had been speculating about that as well since the weekend attacks, or is it just simply now going to refocus its attention back on Israel?
Well, essentially, that's going to be a big question for the Iranian leadership, and it's going to be a scenario that Vladimir Putin in Russia is going to be watching very closely, seeing how the United States primarily is sort of managing and responding to the escalation chain that's going on, and trying to draw potential lessons and insights for how it is conducting future operations within Ukraine. The closing or potential closing or threat to close the Straits of Hormuz and sort of impacting around about a quarter of the world's oil supplies and other trade and logistics moving through that strait has a potentially some quite sort of lasting potential ramifications, but it's very much something that would be expected. So whether there have been mitigations from it, I know from the United Kingdom side, we had 3 warships operating in the Gulf within the past sort of week to 10 days that were due to sail over to the Far East that didn't leave to go there. So they stayed in the region. Why? Probably because they were expecting they might have to do something to protect shipping in case of some sort of escalation. So there seems to have been an element of pre-planning and pre-preparedness to cover off a potential closing of the straits to ensure the safety of shipping.
And Gavin, we have Donald Trump, as I say, talking about how it's now time to proceed to peace, as he put it. EU leaders as well, including the French president, calling for a return to negotiations. Is there any likelihood that that's about to happen?
Whether there's a likelihood of it happening in the very short term, probably not, because we've seen Israel has been targeting Iran today, including the roads leading up to the Fordo side. Iran's been targeting Israel with the launch of missiles towards Tel Aviv. We've also seen President Macron and Prime Minister Storer in Oslo today saying that the risk of escalation is obvious ahead of the NATO summit, but also making it clear that there shouldn't be regime change within Iran. So there seems to be a sort of a clear setting out of what different countries' parameters and objectives are ahead of the NATO summit, which starts tomorrow. So there's going to be potential for further developments within the next 24 hours.
And Gavin, Israel, meanwhile, it's been expanding its campaign today, saying it's carried out its most extensive wave of attacks ever on Iran, also widening the net. How emboldened is Netanyahu here by Donald Trump's decision to join in with those strikes over the weekend on Iranian nuclear facilities?
Yeah, so it certainly demonstrates that the United States is prepared to deploy military force to support Israel, or at least to contain what it considered to be a potential serious threat coming from Iran. So in that sense, it is supporting Netanyahu in Israel. However, Trump is also trying to be clear that he's expecting a sort of peaceful outcome to this and negotiations to happen very much in the same way as he's been making similar points in Ukraine and Russia. But as in Ukraine and Russia, there hasn't actually been much follow through on that other than words. So is there reason to expect something similar to occur in Israel? Probably not. And that's kind of leading towards an assessment that Netanyahu has no reason to stop his actions unless there's a substantive change from Iran, which probably means giving up some of its uranium that it may or may not have siphoned away from Fordo in the sort of previous few days.
And Gavin, this all comes as NATO leaders are about to meet. Just how much is at stake here? If Donald Trump does attend, it'll be his first time being there since he was re-elected.
Yeah, well, NATO's got a couple of big things to consider starting tomorrow. First of all, one of the key things to look out for is what is actually put forward as the number one, the main outcome of the summit. Is it still going to be Russia that is deemed the top threat and the main priority, or are we going to see a sort of shift in focus towards more towards China and the far east, which would align a lot more with US interests, where the European countries are a lot more focused on Russia? We've already had the Secretary General, Mark Rutte, signalling that there's going to be some kind of an agreement on a 5% defence investment pledge, which has many interesting things about it, not least the choice of adding the word investment into that, because that's a very broad term that can include a whole range of things. For example, you can argue that building a new train line is defence investment because it enables troop movements and things, whereas the previous agreement from the Wales summit in 2014 was very clear it was just defence. So it's a little bit more nebulous and broader. So there are a lot of potential areas for negotiation. So exactly how the summit communique is worded will be something we can draw quite a bit of inference from, I believe.
And of course, Ukraine had been expected to be very high on the agenda there during that NATO meeting. Do you expect that to still be the case if Donald Trump is there? Could there be, a risk of rows breaking out between him and his European allies?
Well, I think there'll certainly be some heated discussions away from the public eye. Quite often, these are taking place at sort of the ambassadors' dinner and lunches and things outside of the actual summit. So the presenting of unity is something that'll be absolutely key and central. But we'll get a sense of that as to what actually is agreed, because NATO, of course, operates on consensus. So everything that's done is done without the objection of any one ally. And if it's a slightly more vague and nebulous document, then it's going to be potentially indicate that there's been a little bit of discord behind the scenes. Whereas if it's very clear and strong in its choice of language, labeling Russia as an aggressive entity, for example, or whether it's just going to be a strategic competitor, as it has been in the past, then that will start to tell us something about whether how closely aligned the European nations and the United States are in their view on how to deal with both Ukraine and also Israel, Iran, and China as well.
And just finally, Gavin, while these calls are ongoing from Donald Trump, from Europe, for talks to begin, negotiations for Iran to get back to the table, so to speak, it's actually been meeting Vladimir Putin in Russia. The Iranian foreign minister was there earlier. Where does all of this leave Russia? What kind of position is it going to be in, given the ongoing situation in the Middle East? And how isolated really is Iran at this point?
Well, Tehran is semi-isolated. It's been in sort of competition with Saudi Arabia for as the sort of dominant security actor within the Middle East for a number of years. The conflict in Yemen, for example, is essentially a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So it has a degree of influence, not least in its ability to supply and develop drones, which are highly capable, which it's been sending to Russia for them to use in Ukraine. But I think President Putin views Israel-Iran as a potential opportunity. Is it going to be a distraction that's going to take focus away from what's going on in Ukraine, in which case it will benefit him? Or is there some way he can place some form of role to try and reintegrate Russia into the international order? It was only 2 or 3 days ago, I think, Putin actually offered to mediate between Israel and Iran to try and draw out a peace clause, as opposed to Donald Trump, which of course would elevate his importance because he does have a sort of the ears of both Israel and Iran from that.
OK, Gavin, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you so much for being with us on the programme this evening, though. That's Dr Gavin Hall, Teaching Fellow in Political Science and International Security at the University of Strathclyde. Well, that's it from us for now. Do stay with us, though, for more World News.